Greetings and welcome back to Another Perspectives. This is, I think, well, I say this every episode, right? A very special one because I've been trying to get a Korean, specifically a South Korean, to come on for ages. And I finally succeeded. So the person I have here with me is Jiho, and I think what's maybe unique about his experience is that he's had extensive experience in both the United States and in South Korea, and his English is excellent, and I think it's a good way to start the conversation is to talk about the very vast differences between, say, South Korea and the United States. So welcome to the podcast, Jiho. Thank you for joining me. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you for having me, Stardust.
So you're Korean, but you've spent a lot of time in the United States.
That's right.
I mean, it's kind of a cheesy question, but yeah. So what are some of the obvious differences between South Korea and the United States on the most basic level?
So I think what's really important is, I mean, this is, people, you're going to have heard this before, but to the degree which Americans are sort of individualistic, and then Koreans or East Asians are going to be collective. I think one of the more important things I do see is in the family. This is because Koreans will value the family. And this is not just the nuclear family, it's the extended family. They're sort of conditioned to value the family, whereas I think in America that's not necessarily the case. And then I think in my work, so I'm a PhD student in economics right now. I'm about to graduate, especially the way that you deal with your teachers here. With my advisors, I go on a first name basis. This is really not imaginable in Korea. You would never call anyone older than you on a first name basis, and in particular somebody like a professor. So that's one thing that I kind of it's a experience that I see daily.
Do you find it difficult to transition? I mean, you're essentially describing the Confucian, Yu-Gi-Oh, this Confucian attitude, jiok being family, being very important there. But also how you address a professor, which is it's like an esteemed title. Do you find it difficult transitioning from one 문화, sorry, I keep on the screen, culture to the other? Because obviously, I don't know what your supervisor's name is, like, hey, Dave, can you look at what I wrote? I mean, you can't do that in South Korea. Do you find it difficult? Because I remember one of my exes, Korean, also spent a lot of time in the States, that when I observed her coming back and forth, there was this sort of readjustment period, it seems. It seems like she would transform back into sort of the collective Korean person, and then when she come back to the United States, she'd adapt the local sort of individual thing. But there was a slight transition. Do you find you struggle? Struggle is the wrong word. Do you find that you experience that?
So right now in my current state, I kind of switch. It's kind of like a switch on and off. So I switch into my Confucian state, and then I switch off, and I try to imitate the American way of doing things. Mm-hmm. This wasn't initially very easy to begin with. So tell you a little bit about my personal history. I spent about 4 years during elementary school in the Midwest of the United States. And then I went back to Korea. So at that time, I was in 6th grade. I wasn't used to, Stardust has talked about this before, but I wasn't used to the language of how you're supposed to address your elders. And I addressed my teacher in a way that you're supposed to address your classmates. This was in 6th grade, like a couple of months after I got back to Korea. And then, so this is in the 90s. And then what happened is she told me to get up and then slap me in the face, basically, in front of everyone. So it kind of, that's the sort of like the readjustment that I had to go through when I was a little younger. I think coming back to the U.S. to do my PhD degree and to have to call my professors on a first name basis, it was kind of awkward, really awkward for me in the beginning. But I think with everybody else around you doing the same thing, you get used to it relatively quickly. I mean, my advisor never told me to call him on a first name basis. Actually, I had to do it on my own. That was actually the difficult part for me.
Yeah, I think I come myself from a bit of an older generation. Yeah. And I remember addressing professors as sir and ma'am, and There is a kind of it's not obviously not the same thing. There's a kind of older tradition in the United States that's a little bit more, I guess, distant or honorific, if you want to use the term.
Yeah.
That's completely disappeared because then years later, when I was working on my master's thesis, it was completely first name basis, and even for me, it took a lot of getting used to. But I think it's obviously a lot easier to transition from the Korean side of things, cultural things, to the United States, because if you say "sir" or something like, no one's going to really flip out. Whereas, I mean, if you address a professor like, "What up, yo?" I don't think you're going to receive the best response.
Yeah, no way. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
But so you spent then you moved back to Korea, and then you spent your entire time there until you started, I guess, university. Is that right?
Yeah. So actually, so what happened was I went to end of my elementary school, middle school, high school, college. I did my military. I worked at a couple of companies, and then I decided to do my PhD. So before doing my PhD, I wasn't here.
All right. What was the work like? I mean, Korean companies are kind of notorious for working you to death, and not just that. The soju evenings with the boss, right? It's like, I think this is something that's difficult to drive home to a Western audience, or particularly American audience. This idea that you've been working all day, and then your boss says, "Come on, guys, we're all going to get drunk, even though you're really tired and want to go home." Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this drinking, you could consider it as part of work. You're not off, actually. So there are certain things you're expected to do in that situation. And so in my work experience, what would happen is after work, the boss says, "Let's go get a drink." We go get drinks. Unfortunately, this is not. This is a lot of drinks, actually. So this is like. 1 or 2 bottles of soju per person, usually, and not only that, oftentimes you end up going to karaoke, and that's actually not very pleasant if you have to go there with your boss. It's no fun at all, and it really, for me, it was really just a part of work, and that's the part of work I really hated. I think I was okay with the long working hours. But I really never got used to the singing, especially. I think I was okay with the drinking as well. The singing, I never really got used to that.
Yeah. Well, I think, something very difficult to explain to Westerners. That's the idea that your boss has that level of power. Like in the West in general, when, let's say, work is over at 1800. That means that work is over. You're not. I mean, maybe if you need to do overtime, you get paid for it. They'll tell you, can you stay in another 2 hours? Usually, you just go home.
Yeah.
I even experienced this working at Hagwon, one of these cram schools. For those who are not aware of what that is, of just you don't really say no to your boss. It took me a long time to realize that you can't say no to your boss without repercussions. Because he basically. There was a lot of conflict for a while between me and my boss back then because I just, these were my working hours, but then I realized that, well, he wants me to work another 3 hours later until like midnight sometimes. And I was like, okay, but that's not what it says in the contract. And it didn't really matter because he was telling me. And in order to make my life easier, it sounds crazy, I just ended up working those extra hours. I did get paid for them, but still, I rather had gone home earlier.
So in my work, nobody like everyone below the boss, no one's there because they want to be there. I think the boss is kind of there because he doesn't want to go home for whatever reason. And if you're unlucky, you're going to get these bosses that really don't want to go home, and you're in big trouble if that happens. I'm kind of surprised though that they would do that in these cram schools as well. I would have expected it to be a little more.
The Hagwon, I mean, the problem, well, I don't know if it's changed, or maybe it has, but back in the day, 10 plus years ago, even further back, they would do their best to kind of take advantage of the ignorance of the Uyghur
Okay.
of the foreigners. So they're like,
Uh-huh.
well, that's just how it's done. And when I first arrived in South Korea, I didn't know any Korean. I didn't know what was going on, so I just kind of listened to what people have to say.
Yeah.
And they said, well, you need to do this, you need to do that. And I thought, okay. And so, yeah, spending extra hours was kind of just part of the job. It wasn't fun,
Yeah.
but it gave me insight into the whole Korean culture thing. But
So one interesting thing I want to add to this is I actually worked at two companies. One company was a smaller company, so there was about like 15 people, and there wasn't that much of those types of activities there. I think in that situation, because the company was so small, I think I could just say, I'm going to quit, or I would give off. I mean, even though I wouldn't say that, I would give off. I mean, Korea is a very context-dependent society, so you kind of give off the vibe that you're not happy or you're not going to stay. And then they'd be a little bit more careful about it. I think the second company I used to work for is more of a more established, and this is like a government-owned enterprise, an SOE. So this is one of those few places in Korea that are left after the Asian financial crisis in 1997 that you are sort of guaranteed a lifetime employment, kind of like in Japan. Even though in Japan I've heard that it's going away now. So in this situation, it's very important for these things to happen and you to be there because you're going to see these people for a long time.
yeah,
And actually, thinking about my overall like job satisfaction, despite me not liking drinking or singing or any of this stuff, overall like job satisfaction was much better at that second workplace. I mean, obviously they did pay better, and the company's a lot more prestigious and everything like that.
right. Well, I mean, but ultimately you decided that staying there in that kind of environment wasn't for you, and you'd prefer to do a PhD in the United States. And
That's right.
You're actually not going back to Korea, you're going to Singapore. So
Yeah. I mean, the reasons for not going back are a little different. It's related to pay. So in Korea, the pay is also based on hierarchy. So it depends on like how long you've been at the company. It really doesn't matter how capable you are.
right.
That's changing to some little bit, but regardless of like the qualifications or the job offers that you may have elsewhere, it's not going to really reflect into how much you're going to get paid. So that's why I ended up not going back.
Yeah, I mean, Singapore is, arguably economically much more dynamic, so it makes sense that you'd you'd choose to go there instead of South Korea.
Yeah.
I mean, if someone were to ask you, do you prefer living in the West or in South Korea, what would your answer be?
So I'm actually kind of mixed. It's half and half. I think if I were to stay in the United States, I do like sort of some of the. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it does feel like this has kind of slipped away. I do like kind of like the way sort of the average American in the Midwest, that area, kind of thinks about things, or their views on politics or economics, or guns for that matter. I think that sort of thing I'm really attracted to. Otherwise, I think a lot of the Koreans around me, one of the reasons that they want to go back is sort of the city life or the safety, I guess. Some of them aren't really feel it's kind of unsafe in the United States.
Well, compared to South Korea, it absolutely is.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, basically for the listeners, I think the homicide rate is about. I mean, it depends on when you look at it and how comparable it is. The data is because a lot of times these crime statistics aren't comparable 1-to-1. But the homicide rate is about 5 times higher in the United States than it is there.
Yeah. I mean, South Korea is one of the safest places you can go. I mean, it's evidenced by the fact, at least back in the day, when I was remembering, working there, you'd see, school children walking around at 11:30 p.m.
Yeah, that's right.
You'd never see that in any major city in the United States. I don't think, at least. Maybe, I don't think so.
Yeah.
So I could definitely understand that, but also the cultural thing. I think for a lot of, hard to say, but in my experience, say with my ex that sort of was swapping between South Korea and the United States on a somewhat regular basis, being in the United States was kind of a relief in some sense because, well, there wasn't. I guess for her, the whole Confucian thing, Yu-Gi-Oh, was a kind of a burden, like a budam, you know.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a lot of women that do feel that way. So in a Confucian society, this is still an extended family.
Yeah.
So the woman, it's not just her husband that she has to. I mean, not that they pay attention to it, but it's not just the husband. The family just includes more than just a husband and wife. It's each parent on either side. And given that it's a male-dominated Confucian type of hierarchy, a lot of women feel very uncomfortable in dealing with their in-laws, and I think it's a huge source of stress for a lot of Korean women, and that would be one reason that they want to go to the West, I think.
Oh yeah, she loved escaping, and to this day, I guess her father just has endless amounts of money. Has financed her.
Oh, really?
She's still, yeah. She finished studying in New York City, and
okay.
Then she did something in Berlin, and then I think she still spent the last couple of years in Copenhagen at some prestigious design university there. I have no idea from what I've heard, but yeah. I mean, you get those too, but I'm certain that she prefers living in the West to South Korea just because of the obligations and what have you, because if she were to go back there, how old is she these days? I guess she'd be about 28 or something. Like, she'd be expected to get married soon.
Oh yeah. This, if she's 28, I think she's probably feeling it, from her dad, whoever's financing her, expensive education.
Yeah.
To get married
I don't have
right
contact with her anymore, but I would imagine that the parents are probably thinking, well, we spent they probably spent six figures several times over on her by now, but that they're probably you need to get married. What do you call those arranged dates in Korean that the parents they do the matchmaking? There was a term I forgot. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. So that's called I can't.
You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Yes, I do. So this is a
Confucian thing.
This is a meeting that you're going to have with the other sex on the context that you will get married if this works out.
Yeah.
This is called son.
Yeah.
Sonbuna.
Yeah. So, I mean that's the kind of thing that you just is well. It used to exist in the West, 2 centuries ago, maybe 150 years, but not. I mean, no one in the West would ever do it. Go, well, we have this person. You're going to meet this person. You're going to get married. But I think this is.
Well, I mean, the way it works is you meet this person. If you like this person, you are going to get married. If you don't like it, we'll arrange another son. It's,
until
you find it. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I definitely had that feeling. I also dated another Korean girl in the UK, and every Korean woman I've met abroad, I'm not saying they're unique, they're just women, but I find that they themselves find themselves split between the obligations they feel towards Confucian Korean society, living there, their families, blah blah blah, and escaping that. It's interesting.
So I think with Confucianism, it's a philosophy or an ethic based on hierarchy and order, and given that it's such a there's an ideal Confucian society, and no society has ever reached that ideal, and that's less true for South Korea now. So South Korea, you can think of it as sort of South Korea in relation to Confucianism is sort of like, even though I've never been to Europe, I think it's sort of the relationship between Europe and Christianity. A lot of the customs are based off of it. The people don't really think that much of Confucianism, but it really explains why they're doing it, even though they won't acknowledge the fact that they're doing it. And given that the ideology itself is very rigid in many ways, a lot of people feel kind of stifled by it. But at the same time, there is some sort of comfort in the order, because there is very little chaos, if I could say it that way.
Yeah, and that's been my experience observing Koreans, that a lot of them resent it, especially the women, but
Yeah.
there's something nice about it. There's something
Yeah.
nice to sort of come back to that security, even if, the jiok, the family
Yeah.
unit,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
something, I guess, sacred about that. But at the same time, especially the women, everyone let's see, I guess abroad, I've dated 3 Korean women, and
Uh-huh.
they all just, they all were torn between this, I want to live in the West and do this Western thing, but
Yeah.
there are all these strings at home pulling me back, and they find it very difficult to resist, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's in a way that isn't really, it can't be adjusted in a harmonious way, I think, unfortunately. So usually you end up having to choose one sort of way of living, oftentimes.
Yeah, and I know stories of Korean women that just abandon South Korea. Maybe they find an American husband or whatever, but they get a green card. But no, I don't. I kind of feel bad for them. I get it. I mean, no offense, but
Uh-huh.
I mean, Korean Confucianist society, all that conformity and obligations, that's not for me. I experienced part of that, even though I was a foreigner. But
Uh-huh.
but I mean, it's just not for me, and I can understand why people want to escape that. What about the men, though? I mean, clearly, yeah. I mean, your thoughts on that?
So I think for men, they have more of a say. I mean, you still have to be part of the order, but it's possible. I mean, the family isn't as constraining for the men as it is for the women, I think. Yeah. At least not yet. I mean, it's changing. So a lot of, if you go on a lot of these Korean internet forums, a lot of the guys are unhappy as well. But
yeah, tell me about
it. It's not like they're going to marry a white woman and get away from this. They don't really have a choice. They're kind of stuck in a lot of cases.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's the thing. I mean, a lot of it, a big deal is made of, the poor Korean women, but the men, they work themselves to the bone. I mean, the men aren't exactly the happiest people in the world either.
No. I mean, you're working, like you're drinking, you're working, you're singing. I mean, there's none of these things you want to ever do. A lot of my friends, I mean, when I go to Korea and I want to meet my friends, I make an appointment at like 8 or 9. A lot of them show up at 11 or 12. And then if they're married, they stay for like 20 minutes and go back home because their wife is nagging them.
Yeah.
So I mean, they're not that happy.
No.
You'd think, and also there's an issue with Korean men is the military. So you have to serve. In my case, I had to serve 28 months.
That's a lot. Yeah.
And this military, it's not like it's the conditions in there are pretty bad. I think the system itself is sort of designed to control the enlisted men.
Yeah.
So I heard this is the Japanese copied it off the Germans, the Prussian system back then, and then we copied off the Japanese. So what happens is the enlisted men have to kind of keep each other in order based on when you enter the military. So it's extremely hierarchical. You can't really you're limited in terms of communication, so you can't really contact people outside. So out of the 28 months that you're in there, you're only given 35 days of break, and then about 10 days of one day breaks.
Yeah, and that's always struck me. I mean, it's obvious why they do that, but so my ex had an older brother who, the older brother, he had the military service. He was trying to finish his degree. I think he went back to Korea to work. But his sister is just running around, sort of gallivanting around the globe on her father's dime.
Yeah.
Doing, eating in expensive restaurants in New York, sometimes on my dime, living in one of the most expensive cities in Europe, and the brother is just expected to fulfill all of these obligations.
So I think once the women get married, then they have the obligations, and they don't like it. The men, I think, it doesn't really change that much before or after marriage. You're still obligated to do a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
So
got to do stuff for your mother, for your sister, for the extended family, blah blah blah. Yeah, I mean, my observation of most Korean guys, to be honest, is that most of them are pretty miserable. They don't talk about it, but they just
they don't talk about it.
I mean, it's a cultural taboo. You're not going to talk about how miserable you are, and I don't know. I mean, it's not my place to criticize Korean society, like, well, Koreans need to do it a different way. But, I mean, there's a trade-off. I mean, there's a trade-off for the sort of the hyper-individualism that you find in the West, but there's a trade-off for the Confucianist society in South Korea as well. And I've seen, as I pointed out, the women are trying to escape, the men are, well, they can't really escape as easily, but they're not particularly happy. I mean, and let's be honest, you're probably happier in the United States than you are in South Korea, right?
I mean,
well, maybe not. I don't know.
So I think, I don't know about that. I think I had it. I mean, other than that singing thing, which I really hated. Other than that, I think I had it working out pretty well.
Okay.
So I mean, once I could overcome that drinking and singing thing, which I really couldn't get used to, it's kind of surprising because a lot of Koreans are pretty good at it. I just being me, being myself, I really couldn't do it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, but by now, many of these older systems are sort of cracking. I mean, the phenomenon of divorce, ihon, is been on. I've talked about this a lot on my channel. I mean, the divorce rates are pretty much the same in South Korea these days as they are in the West.
Yeah, and also the interesting thing is it's not just the young people; it's actually the older people that are getting divorced a lot. So these are the people that have like kind of grown up in a much more traditional society than even I've experienced, and these people are kind of saying, it's not worth it. I think it's also usually the women who are initiating the divorce a lot of times.
Well, yeah, I mean that's a universal across the world. Every country you examine, you see it's always the majority, at least the majority of the people who initiated the divorce are the women.
Yeah.
And I think they're doing it now in South Korea more and more because, well, the opportunity is there, and it's not as taboo as it used to be. I mean, even 20 years ago in South Korea, getting divorced was a big deal. But now it's kind of like, oh, celebrities do it. This person did it. It's not whatever,
Yeah. So a lot of people, I mean, the divorce rates have really gone up.
Yeah. I mean, this is part of what I've described as sort of global monoculture. I mean, obviously South Korea is still South Korea, but there are, I guess, societal trends that have affected just pretty much every industrialized society across the globe. And, go on, please.
Yeah, so in the case of Korea, it's slowly been de-Confucius, becoming, devolving from the traditional Confucian ideology ever since the Japanese took over, basically. So it's 1910.
Yeah.
Ever since then, it's slowly devolving away. And Confucianism is not as ideologically as addictive. I don't know if that's right, addictive or strong as some of the other religions, like for example, I think the Islam or Judaism or Christianity. So Confucianism never really had like a strong reason. They don't really give you a strong reason why you should follow what Confucius said. I think the best I've ever gotten to, when I ask somebody who knows about this stuff, is that it's better for society, better for societal order to do it this way. It's not really about like because God told you to or something like that. Which is I think more attractive actually if you think about it to some.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a huge Christian population in South Korea. Was it like 40% at least? Last time I checked, maybe it's 50% now. Actually,
it's 33.
Oh, it's gone down. Like it used to be higher.
It's gone down. Yeah, it's gone down. So I think people, one of the reasons is the Korean population is becoming more leftist, especially with the younger generation. So they don't like religion as much as the older guys do.
Right. So do you think? So I mean, I've been out of the loop, but. A lot of these things that we can observe in, say, the United States and Canada and Europe to some extent with the far left thinking and the craziness, the SJWs, has that arrived in South Korea too? Is that a real thing?
It has tried to arrive, but it's not successful yet. So I think one example is I think last year what happened was so this is Gangnam Station.
famous.
Of the famous Gangnam Style. Yeah, so this at Gangnam Station, this is a subway station, by the way. There was a couple who went to a noraebang there, a karaoke there, and the girlfriend went to the restroom, and she was killed in the restroom by this like psychopath that had something against women for some reason. Okay. And then after that became known, all these feminists in Korea kind of came out, and they were kind of they tried to make a movement on that fact, on that incident, and try to say this is because Korean society is misogynist, and they hate women in a way that kind of induced this sort of behavior. And I think what I found, to my surprise actually, is that a lot of these Korean guys who would otherwise be pretty progressive or leftist, they didn't buy any of it. They said this has nothing to do with society. You know, it's just one crazy guy. And like the Korean guys always like to bring up the military when feminists say anything. So they always bring up the fact, you know, I have to go stuck in the military for 24 months or in my case, 28 months. Mm-hmm. So this type of debate is never about logic anyway, right? So it's trying to see who's the bigger victim. So I was kind of surprised to see the fact that sort of SJW-ism that I thought might happen hasn't really happened yet. But I mean, I don't see how we would be free from that going forward. I think a lot of these guys that are sort of like 90s Democrat, I guess, type left wing. I mean, it seems to me inevitable that these people would become SJW in the future, but just at a lag pace.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know how long you've been subbed to me, but I've documented the fact that all these trends have sort of infected all sorts of places, like India as well.
Yeah.
Japan. Talked about South Korea before. It's, you know, once it sets foot someplace, usually it's women, to be honest, who find it very attractive and they buy into it, and all of a sudden they're complaining. I mean, even I think I covered this years ago, but there was some story about some famous Korean actress who wanted a divorce. It involved cheating or something, and I think the court wanted to punish her or imprison her because you remember there used to be stricter laws on that. And
oh yeah, adultery laws.
Yeah. And everyone came out. Everyone, meaning the women, came out. So, you can't do this, and I think the laws were actually repealed. I don't think they're there anymore.
It's now found to be unconstitutional, so they got rid of it.
Yeah.
Actually, the actual motivation for introducing adultery laws initially was to protect women, actually, believe it or not. So back in the early 20th century or late 19th century, a lot of the wealthier Korean guys had multiple wives, so they had concubines.
Yeah.
And even after they're not supposed to have concubines, they you know, if you had wealth, I mean,
right,
you're going to have multiple sex partners, right?
Right.
So I think one of the reasons why they wanted to adopt this adultery law was to have some sort of legal mechanism for women to get after the men, Otherwise, they had no power over them. But now, since, you know, adultery is not just a male thing anymore. It's also, women get caught in it all the time. And now, since they're the victims of this law, I think they got rid of it.
Yeah. It's always like that. But I remember when I was living there that, you know, you could go to jail for cheating on your spouse. It was interesting.
Yeah. So usually people used it. It wasn't an actively enforced law. So I mean, the police did enforce it because they sort of had to, because it's in the legal code. But usually it was used as a mechanism to get good divorce terms. So basically, if you don't agree to give me like 90% of your wealth, I'm going to put you in jail. That sort of negotiation card.
Yeah. And I think that certain conservative people would really be pretty unhappy about this, but I think it's an inevitability. As long as you have the internet and everyone's interconnected, this sort of thing's going to happen. I mean, esports is a thing in the United States and that came from Korea, for example.
Yeah, yeah, it was pretty big when I was growing up. I mean, I guess when I was in college, I guess, but
What? Starcraft, yeah.
yeah.
Starcraft, yeah. So
Yeah.
I think that there's just no, people might misascribe something to me like I'm a globalist. I'm not. I'm just observing. I'm basically observing a phenomenon that's undeniable. There's a global phenomenon. You could call it kind of monoculturalism, where every country that's sharing an information is taking on certain attributes and qualities, and it just happens almost organically. So the stuff that's happening in South Korea that we're talking about, nobody ran in and said we're going to do this because blah blah blah. No, it just happened organically, and I think it's inevitable given what we know about human beings.
Yeah, and also there's not really of a good. A lot of times, even if you want to preserve this tradition, a lot of the people can't give convincing logic as to why somebody who doesn't want to do it should do it. So let's say, I mean, if I tell a Korean woman you should be like, you should act like what Confucius told you, she's going to tell me to fuck off. And it really don't have a good way of, telling her otherwise, or even if I wanted to tell her, I mean, of course I don't, but
yeah.
There's no logic. I mean, there's no good form of resistance against this monoculture, as you call it.
Yeah. But I mean, there's still differences. I mean, I'm not saying that Korean women are fundamentally different, but my experience, I dated a few there, but they're very demanding, in the sense that they want constant attention. I'd say far more than Western women. I don't know if you've observed this too.
For me, I think one of the things that I don't like, I don't know if this is true for Western women because I haven't dated Western women, but I feel that a lot of them are too, they're too suspicious, or they're too controlling. It seems.
Yeah.
And then also I mean, a lot of Korean, one of the things that Korean guys complain about is it's not full egalitarianism. So they take the benefits of tradition when they want to, and then when it's against their interests, they're saying, well, things should be equal. You have to, let's say there's a Korean guy who's working until 11 p.m. They go home and there's this Korean housewife, and she's complaining to you about having to take care of the kids or something like that, and you have to take a more equal role in cooking or doing the dishes or taking care of the kids. And a lot of Korean guys are kind of obviously understandably frustrated about that kind of situation.
Well, I mean, talk about honoring tradition when it suits them and not honoring it when I think every woman does that, but
yeah.
But Korean women are experts at that. I mean, my last Korean ex had such a pampered. I mean, she wasn't mentally ill or anything. She was quite normal, but she just had this entitlement mentality that surpassed anything I'd ever encountered. Because I've dated both Asian and I guess you call it European women. That's pretty much it. And you couldn't compare it. I mean, it's true that her mind, at least at the time, wasn't filled with feminist drivel and nonsense, but still, having to take her out, demanding that I take her out, yada yada yada, the amount of attention that she was supposed to receive, and then that was the same in South Korea. I mean, there was one notable exception I could kind of think of, but yeah, the vast majority of them just attention-seeking, controlling, always difficult to deal with.
Yeah. I mean, so I can't really make a comparison on this because I really haven't dated other women from other nationalities. But I mean, that's what that's true for a lot of Korean guys as well. They've never really dated outside the race.
Yeah. Is that intentional, or do you just not? I mean,
for a lot of people living in Korea, I don't think they're not really looking for it, or if they were looking for it, I don't think they're capable of doing it. And there's not a lot of, I mean, Korea is a pretty homogenous society. You're not going to find a lot of people like that.
Obviously. Yeah. I mean, that definitely makes sense. I mean, but I think this should dispel the myth. I mean, I don't think any of my subs actually think these days that you can go to places like South Korea and find some devoted traditional wife.
Maybe in Saudi Arabia. Who knows?
Maybe in Saudi Arabia, right? Um, I guess. I guess if you've never heard anything I've said before, then yeah, that it might be surprising. But yeah, you're not gonna. Korean women are just like other women, and they're really, if anything, they're more demanding and more annoying because they think they're more entitled, they're more controlling. I'd argue they nag more too.
I mean, a lot of Korean guys have that perception, even though they don't know from their experience. They do think that Korean women are way more nagging. But interestingly enough, within the East Asian countries, the reputation is that the Chinese women are the worst.
Yeah, I've heard
in terms
that too.
in terms of this attitude. Koreans are in the middle, and Japanese are better. For what it's worth.
I've heard that. I've heard,
Yeah.
Chinese are the worst, Koreans are in the middle, and the Japanese are kind of the most laid back. The women, at least, are most laid back about that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess the point is that for all the Western men who think they're gonna slink off to China or South Korea or Japan to find some dream woman who's gonna, I don't know, cook you meals every day and massage your shoulders, keep dreaming.
Well, I mean, you might be able to find a woman. I mean, it might be easier to find a woman, but I'm not sure if that's the kind of woman that you had in mind.
Yeah, no, I mean,
Yeah.
look, if
Yeah.
you're a Western guy who makes decent money, it's not that, and you look okay, it's not that hard to find a Korean girl.
Yeah.
I don't think. But question is, are if that's going to live up to your expectations. I mean, by now, all my subs know that women are women. It doesn't. Yes, there's some differences in the cultures, but at the end of the day, they're going to behave like women do. So,
Yeah. So I think,
Yeah.
So in Confucius ideology, everybody has their role in the hierarchy. So the men have their role, the women have their role. So the women are going to ask the husband to do his role that is traditionally done by husbands, but at the same time, they're going to rationalize why they're not going to do their role. So that's something you should expect if you're thinking seriously about this.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of this, we were talking about just before the crisis in '97.
Yeah.
Even my ex seemed to remember that, which was odd. She every now and then had an insightful thing to say.
Okay.
Maybe once a year or something. But
Okay.
she was talking about actually. It's a bit of a detour, but I remember being in New York City with her, and this is the thing of a 2-year relationship I had with her. The most insightful thing she ever said: looking at a fountain, and the water of the fountain was going up, and against the grain, as it were. And she said, "That's a very Western thing, the water pushing upwards." And I thought,
yeah.
This was the most insightful, brilliant thing she ever said to me in a 2-year relationship, and I still remember it. In any event, I mean, maybe for those of you, you're an economist, obviously, but for those who are unaware or not familiar, why don't you tell us about it wasn't obviously just South Korea. It was, I mean, technically it was called, I think, the Southeast Asian.
Yeah, initially it was. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, maybe go into some of the details of what happened exactly.
Okay, so let me give you a little bit of background into what happened. So Korean society, Korean economics is based off the Japanese model. So it was a former Japanese colony from 1910 to 1945. So a lot of the Japanese, like the institutions, kind of stayed behind, even though they left. The education, the economy, and everything like that. So one of the things that happened was a lot of people had lifetime employment. And I mean so I'll talk about lifetime employment in a bit. One of the other things is the government has a lot of say over the private sector. Regardless of whether or not the government has ownership, they have a lot of say in what the private sector does. One of the things that government introduced was the private firms, the manufacturing firms like Samsung, Hyundai, and all these other firms, they had to borrow through the Korean financial institutions to get access to foreign capital, So the capital markets in Korea were not open. The foreign capital, what they did was they lent this money out. The Korean financial institutions, they lent this money out to the Korean manufacturing companies for long-term. So these were long-term debt, and at the same time, they would borrow from the West, basically, at a short-term interest. So this at a short-term maturity. So if you borrow at a short-term maturity and you lend at a long-term maturity, you have sort of a mismatch in sort of what can happen in terms if the creditors on your side want their money back. But the reason why they did this is because the interest rates are always going to be lower for the short-term borrowing than it is for long-term borrowing. So this is how a lot of Korean financial institutions worked. In 97, what happened was something happened in Thailand. I think there was sort of this domino effect all over East Asia on financial, on the ability to repay the debt, I suppose. And then this spread to South Korea. And a lot of these foreign investors kind of wanted their money back because they weren't sure they were going to get it. A lot of these banks had lent out at short maturity, so they couldn't really refuse their money without going bankrupt. And then at the same time, what happens is because a lot of people want U.S. dollars now and want to take money out of Korea, the value of the Korean currency, Korean won, started to kind of like drop rapidly. So these Korean financial institutions were in sort of a double bind where they had lent to Korean firms in the local currency. They had to pay back in the U.S. dollars. They had lent in long-term maturities, but had to pay back in short-term maturities. So they were in a bind. The government tried to support the financial institutions by trying to maintain the exchange rate. It used to be a fixed exchange rate. Now it's a free exchange rate. But by doing that, they ran out of dollar reserves, so they didn't have any dollars anymore. Essentially, the Korean government kind of made it sound like the country was bankrupt. So everybody in Korea thought we were bankrupt. And then we had to take in money from the IMF, just like Greece is doing right now.
Yeah.
And unlike Greece, what happened is they introduced austerity measures that isn't, compared to what happened to Korea in the 1997, what happened to Greece is pretty lenient. But this might be actually worse for Greece, though. The fact that they were lenient is because the IMF required Korea to do basically
If I might interject you, I think the reason why the IMF, we're talking about the International Monetary Fund for those who don't know what the acronym stands for, was more lenient with Greece is because, unlike South Korea, Greece is part of this super political economic union, and overly penalizing Greece could have potential ramifications. I mean, European Union is also an economic union. What happens to Greece has an effect on the rest of the countries, unfortunately. Whereas South Korea exists in, well, I would say isolation, but you see my point.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
So, penalizing Greece would have effects for the entirety of the European Union. I think the euro would have probably dissolved if they didn't do what they did.
Yeah.
There are reasons why they did that. So what happened was in Korea, they had three major reforms that they wanted us to take. Actually, they raised interest rates. They introduced fiscal balance in fiscal policy, so you couldn't spend more than your tax revenues. And then they also introduced transparency reforms. So any sort of all this broad reforms across the economy. And I think and the South Korean economy after 1997, basically what happened was it became more like a Western sort of neoclassical type of economy, a type of rule sets and type of system. So lifetime employment went away. I think a lot of people still kind of miss those days where they had that kind of economic life in Korea is much more uncertain.
But we should mention the chaebol. Chaebol still exists. We should talk about what the chaebol. So, chaebol, it's literally, I think, if you were to translate it from Korean to English, it's like a wealth family or
yeah. The word for word would be from Chinese characters to English would be that.
Yeah. So chaebol, so it's basically these big business conglomerates that have a million family ties to each other,
Yeah.
that have been running the economic show for everything you can recognize in terms of exports from South Korea. Say if you're an American, like things like Samsung, Hyundai, things like that.
Yeah.
That's all chaebol as far as I know. Correct me if I'm wrong.
That's right. That's right.
So maybe
The
tell us a little.
only company that I know that some people might know that isn't a chaebol is POSCO. I don't know if people have heard about this. This is a steel maker based off of Pohang in South Korea.
Oh, okay.
And that's not. So this used to be government owned, but the government kind of sold off all the shares to the citizens, basically. So it's not government owned, but it's still government controlled, by the way. It's not a chaebol. I think that's the one company that's an exception. Otherwise, I don't think. I don't think there are companies that aren't chaebol.
So despite all the, despite the reforms that were implemented, this economic superstructure is still a very important aspect of the South Korean economy.
Yeah, so I think one reform that they tried doing is initially they wanted the chaebols to kind of focus on one type of business. So Samsung used to have an auto company, by the way. LG used to make semiconductors. And a lot of these other things that people today, even in Korea, don't really know that much about. They kind of merged. The government kind of forced these chaebols to kind of reorganize into what they thought was their competitiveness. But they're still around, and even though you want them to restrain themselves, they're still going to expand into other businesses. So they're still there. They're still very prevalent in the life. And in terms of the ownership structure, they wanted it to become less messy because they had really complex structures regarding the ownership organization. By the way, this is true for Europe too. If you look at some of these European companies, there's like this complex ownership structure where company A owns B, that owns A again, and owns C. I mean, it's really complicated. United States is not one of those nations. It's more of an exception, I think.
Interesting. Well, yeah, maybe right. I mean, you could say it's, I guess, quote unquote, more capitalist, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, do you foresee a time in the future where the chaebol structure would just totally dissolve and just nobody would think it's a good idea?
So I think one issue for chaebols, the next issue for chaebols right now, I think, is my expectation is that a lot of these families are probably going to emigrate outside of Korea. And this is due to estate tax. Previously, so the estate tax for South Korea is, I think, the second highest in the world after Japan. So we're like at 45% or 40%. Japan's like 45 or 50. So I'm within the OECD countries. Japan's the highest, and South Korea is second highest, if I recall correctly. And the chaebols, when they used to kind of give their ownership to their sons, and it's usually the sons. Usually they had to go kind of like go around the law. Well, it used to be okay back then, but it's increasingly not okay anymore. And a lot of these chaebols have gone to prison for that. And I think the current chairman of Samsung, the son, who is now in control because the father is he's kind of brain dead, I think, he tried a couple of maneuvers that involved the Korean government and their national pension fund taking the side of Samsung. But now that this Korean president is kind of impeached and the opposition party wants to take over, they're going to ask. We don't know what exactly is going to happen to this Samsung chairman, but it's possible that he could go to jail. And I think more of them will realize that this way of going around the law is not going to work in the future. So I think I would expect them to kind of emigrate to countries where there is no estate tax, and that could bring forward changes that it's hard to predict what would happen in that scenario.
Yeah. But I mean, I think if this kind of economic superstructure, which has been there for such a long time, I mean, the so-called miracle in the Han River, as it's called sometimes, a lot of people attribute that specific phenomenon to the existence of chaebol and the economic structure of South Korea.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm one of the people that actually kind of don't see it as a miracle. It's something. So in East Asia, unless you were communist, no country failed to develop itself economically.
Yeah.
So any country that is based off the Chinese tradition, they're all able to Chinese Confucian tradition, all able to kind of develop themselves economically, and at the same time, they were also initially not democratic. None of these countries were democratic when they initially started out. So I mean, from looking at all this kind of regional trend, I wouldn't really call it a miracle. I think we would have gotten here without this structure.
Yeah, I agree.
But
I've talked about this quite a lot, but I mean, people don't like when I talk about it. But I mean, these countries, China, Singapore, South Korea, Japan, they all have very high average IQs. And, I've done the research. People know my videos. We've talked about this before, but there's a very strong positive correlation with high IQ and wealth and income. And
yeah,
it's why I agree with you. I don't think you necessarily need like a chaebol or whatever to go from A to Z. I've said this before. It's why after the ruins of separating the Korean Peninsula after the Korean War, why in 60, 70 years time, South Korea is an economic superpower, the head of esports, all of this other stuff. And frankly speaking, places in Africa are still shitholes after, years and years of direct economic intervention. I think, to my mind, based on what I've studied, it has the best explanatory power, I think.
Yeah, I think there's also a book by this economist, I think it was called Hive Mind or something like that, that looked at IQs and economic development, like you said. I think he also looked at other things in society as well. I don't recall this off the top of my head, but there's this book called Hive Mind, I think.
Well, there's no doubt that it's not the element of work ethic. I mean, if you're living in a hyper conformist society and you have high IQ, you probably are going to be able to produce pretty good results because everyone's going to be driven, feel obligated to do something. But it's just that. Go on.
So right now, I think if you look at East Asia, the development part, this is going to be correlated with IQ. So I think a lot of the conformist aspects have really driven development. So we were doing kind of manufacturing, low-level manufacturing to more capital-intensive. We went from labor-intensive manufacturing to capital-intensive manufacturing. In a lot of these cases, I think I think the conformist aspect had played a really strong role, and that's probably correlated with IQ to some extent, I believe. In the future, though, East Asian societies in general are probably going to have to kind of, just raw labor-intensive or capital-intensive manufacturing probably isn't going to work out long term. So we're probably going to have to transition into something that's more knowledge-intensive or research-intensive that the West is more better at. And that how we develop into that remains to be seen, I think.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, the fact is that this is obviously something that was much more part of the Japanese and Korean side. This idea of the eternal job, lifetime. Everything is changing. You don't have the same degree of job security just doesn't exist anymore overall.
Yep.
Everything is just different. The economy, for better or worse, it's globalized, and so every country and their economies are going to have to sort of roll with the punches, and the people in those economies in South Korea will also have to roll with the punches. Yeah. And as the more conformist aspects of South Korea disintegrate, you're going to, as you just pointed out, you're going to have to. There's probably going to be some consequence. We can't predict exactly what that might be. Related to how work itself is organized in South Korea and how production is engaged in.
Yeah, it's hard to predict what's going to happen. Who knows? I mean, I guess you've seen this from Koreans. I mean, Koreans do have, from data you can see that they have high IQ. Mm-hmm. But if you look at some of the people there, despite the fact that these people can be, I guess, clever, they're not knowledgeable oftentimes.
Well, they're not
really
very
interested.
creative, I find. I mean, I wouldn't say that's universally the case, but one of the consequences I've observed in Korean society of not having certain freedoms. I'm not saying those. I mean, the freedoms are not officially not there, but it's just part of the society. You know, the structure, the social structures we've talked about.
Yeah.
It doesn't allow for creative thinking or individualist thinking that can sometimes, get you out of a bind or help in certain situations.
Yeah, and I think Koreans internalize failure in a much more destructive way than Americans do. I think that's one of the things I think I've seen about Americans. So I think if Americans, let's say, screw up on something, and a Korean guy screws up on something, let's say something relatively important, I think this Korean guy is probably going to feel a lot more shame. I don't think he's going to be able to deal with it as well.
Right. I mean, this is the difference between, I mean, this is collective society. This is a shame culture. I mean, Korean culture is shame culture. So one Korean does something bad, it looks bad on, it looks bad for all Koreans, supposedly. But
yeah,
that's not really how, I mean, sure, some people will generalize, like, I met a Canadian and he was an asshole, so all Canadian. But that's generally not speaking not how the Western mind operates and not how we really think about things. As you probably have observed with the weird Western people. But yeah, that's very much the case, that you're sort of a representative of Korean culture and society, especially when you're abroad. I guess that I get that sense too.
Yes, I mean, like, even historically, if you look at it, so why you're supposed to succeed on these Confucian exams so you could be a government official in the past, in history. The idea was to so that you can, honor your family, basically.
Yeah.
So that your descendants will kind of worship. It's not actual worship, but sort of worship you in this way. So your success or failure is kind of it's more than you, I guess. It's something, you're part of something that's bigger than you. So, I mean, being successful is that much more important, but at the same time, failing is often, I mean, of course, like you said, this is, whenever you talk about people, we're talking about statistics. This is distributions of what we've observed or what we've seen in data.
Yeah.
And from what I see, it's, I think the Koreans have a hard time taking in failure, I think. Internalized.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and if this is one of the, I mean, there are pros and cons to everything, but this is obviously one of the weaknesses, I think, to collectivist culture of society. I mean, it just is the way it is. I did a video, I think some of my subs might know, where I actually go into a lot of detail. There's actually genetic evidence to suggest that a lot of the cultural phenomena we can observe, say, in South Korean society is actually in the DNA. But
yeah.
One issue we haven't addressed, and I think it's an interesting one. Any given year, and it's not every year, but South Korea is number one in suicide as well. It depends on the year, sometimes it's 2 or 3 or 4. But so maybe we should talk a little bit about that. And we've talked about the amount of pressure people feel. The category of suicide in South Korea, based on my reading and observation, you really get I mean, the biggest spread. I mean, if we were to say have a distribution curve, it's really, on the far right you might get the really, really old people, on the far left, and they're both the biggest representatives. People in middle age, past, I guess, in their 30s, not so much. My understanding is that, you talked about prestige, but if you don't go to Seoul National University or something, and you end up going to Ulsan, where I used to work. That's shameful or whatever. And then on the other end, the elderly, because Korean society is shifting and changing so rapidly, they feel like they're a burden to their families, and they often they kill themselves sometimes. So it seems on two ends. I mean, let's talk about the young suicide phenomenon in South Korea.
Yeah, so I think I'm not sure if the young suicide thing is much of an issue anymore. I think back in the 90s, I haven't looked at the data, by the way, so this is just my feelings. So this is data free, my perception of what happens. For me, it feels like the young suicides. I think a lot of them used to be more about the grades. How can I get to Seoul National? Well, it's not Seoul National, some good university, I guess. I think the rewards to graduating from a prestigious school is becoming smaller than it used to be. So I think back in the day, of course, if you didn't go to these universities, there's a huge difference in what would happen to you, because otherwise you'd have to like work in the rice paddy, or you'd have to work in this labor-intensive factory. And on the other hand, you go to Seoul National University, you become somebody in power, for example. I think that sort of structure has kind of gradually been eroded. So the payoff, I mean, it's still better to go to prestigious university, obviously, in the West as well. But the payoff, the relative payoff isn't as huge as it used to be. And I think there's been years and years of sort of, I guess I wouldn't call it propaganda, but I was sort of this dissemination of the idea that it's not that important. I mean, you can still live a life without having to be from the best university. So I think that part of it, I think, is
right.
not as much of a cause for suicide.
Well, part of that's tied in the idea that there isn't any lifetime employment anyway anymore. So
yeah, exactly.
You don't go to Seoul National University, or trying to think of another one. Kind of escapes me at the moment, but one of the top universities, and so what?
Exactly. So you could be much better off if you could just open a successful restaurant or something like that, without having to graduate from these universities. So I think that aspect has gone down. I think more for me, what seems to be much more of an issue is the older generation committing a lot of suicide. And this has to do with the disintegration of the Confucius society, where you're supposed to, the young people in your family are supposed to take care of you. And I'm sure these people, when they were younger, did the same to their old parents. But that has broken down. I wouldn't say it's completely gone, but for a lot of people who find it difficult to live their own lives and don't feel that Confucius is relevant to them anymore, are not going to. Or some of them are going to refuse to take care of their older parents, and a lot of these older parents have no savings. They don't have anywhere to work because, despite these, the pop demographic bomb that is South Korea right now, despite that fact, it's still a labor. And there's a lot of labor to go around in South Korea, so people aren't looking to hire these people in their 70s, for example. And they have nowhere to work. It's really hard on them economically. I think this type of lifestyle kind of brings into question what they have been living for their entire life. So I think a lot of these older people do commit suicides for those reasons. Yeah.
I mean, and then of course they feel that they're a burden themselves to their families and.
Oh yeah. So I mean, so there's this old legend, and people say that this is actually fake. That was planted by the Japanese during colonization. So before the Joseon dynasty, there was the Goryeo dynasty. This Goryeo dynasty is where the name Korea comes from. And in this dynasty, this is not a Confucius society, by the way. This is a Buddhist society. And in that society, it is rumored to be rumor has it that in that society, when people couldn't take care of their old, they would take them into the forest and then leave them there to die. So this was called the Korea funeral back then. And people deny that. So people say this is a legend that was planted by the Japanese during the colonization. So a lot of people will say this isn't true, but the story is well known. This word is there, and the story is well known. So some of the older people might feel that in the same same idea that it might be better for them to kill themselves to be less of a burden. And I think another factor in Korea is that it's actually easier to commit suicide there. A lot of these apartment buildings have windows that you can jump off from, and that's a pretty popular way to commit suicide.
I'm trying to remember.
Whereas in the United States, a lot of people would commit suicide using guns.
Well, actually, people don't know this, but that's the most common gun-caused death is suicide. It's not people shooting other people. It's mostly men shooting themselves in the head. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I think part of suicide has to do with like how easy it is to kill yourself. I mean, it's not easy. It's actually it can be a little difficult to kill yourself sometimes if you think about it. So
Oh yeah,
yeah,
it's not an easy endeavor. I mean, I'm not even
yeah,
talking about the hesitation involved, but
yeah,
I mean, if you a 9 millimeter to the head, it's pretty relatively easy, I guess,
yeah,
assuming you know the basics.
yeah,
And yeah, I was thinking I don't remember the name. There was a celebrity that jumped out the window of a very tall building in South Korea. A celebrity suicide
yeah.
seems to be another thing, I guess.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, even there's a former president that committed suicide, right? So I mean,
Yeah, I talked about that.
yeah,
Oh,
Dongmyeon.
right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
Because of corruption charges.
yep,
I mean, but this is, I think, is also that's more like that sort of shame society suicide where
yep.
he offered a public apology saying that, well, I'm sorry I brought shame to my family and my cabinet and blah, blah, in the country, blah, blah, blah. This is how I'm going to pay you back. Yeah.
I think actually, the story is that this guy actually didn't know much about the corruption or wasn't that much involved. I think it was his wife and his older brother, and he found out about this like later on, and then I think he felt that. So this is another aspect of suicide in East Asia. It's seen as honorable. So
Yeah.
after he committed suicide, all investigation into his family was dropped.
Yeah.
So that could have been. I mean, he wanted to protect his legacy. He wanted to protect his family. That could have been one of the reasons.
Right, wanted to do them a favor, basically.
Yeah, yeah,
A very expensive way or costly way of doing somebody a favor, but that's something that you don't really see in too much in Western society. This sort of when everything goes to shit, there's always that last resort solution of if you kill yourself, you'll fix it all for everyone who's still alive, pretty much.
yeah. Basically, if you kill yourself, well, people aren't going to be talking bad about you. I think that's the idea. Your honor is sort of protected. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's this kind of honor culture. I mean, there have been different sorts of honor cultures in the past and in the West, but nothing really akin to what you find in South Korea or Korean society or Japanese for that matter.
Yeah, or maybe it's a wrong way to call it honor. Maybe you could say it's relief from shame. So
Yeah, I think that's a good way.
Like,
yeah, relief from
not
shame.
necessarily honorable. It's you're resolving yourself from the shame that you've been involved in.
Yeah. Now, finally, I mean, the other thing that South Korea is famous for is plastic surgery.
Oh yeah, so this I've seen. So I've grown up seeing the changes. So back when I was growing up, it was actually shameful for women to get plastic surgery or to have people know that you have had plastic surgery. So women would be very embarrassed if people found out that they had plastic surgery.
Yeah.
So at the turn of the century, I think a lot of celebrities started out just freely admitting that they had surgery because a lot of times it was so obvious that they couldn't deny it, and then so it became a little bit more widespread. I think the women realized that at the end of the day, you're better off having plastic surgery and looking better than you are not having plastic surgery and looking ugly.
Yeah.
So I think they've rationalized that to an extent that they don't really there's no trace of this like shame for having plastic surgery anymore. So they're very good at this type of rationalization, I would suppose. And then right now, I think there's a whole plastic surgery industry. So if you go to any subway station, they have like these before-after pictures of women before getting plastic surgery and after getting plastic surgery. Mm. And I think these types of marketing techniques, I think, are also pretty effective.
Oh yeah,
yeah,
without a doubt. I mean,
just for $2,000, you can do this.
Isn't Sankapur eyelid surgery? Every woman, every girl does it these days, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, traditionally, so we've always valued, Koreans have valued, I mean, this isn't because of the West, so we have valued bigger eyes and whiter skin as a more beautiful person. Mm-hmm. And some people will claim that this is because of the West, but I mean, you can see historical records of this. I don't think so. So people have always known that, it's better off to have bigger eyes, but, people weren't willing to admit that they had plastic surgery, or wanted to keep it a secret if they did so. This is one of the reasons why this is given as a graduation present to girls graduating from high school.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times college is sort of a new life, and people from your old life, from your high school, will know that you have had this plastic surgery, but people that you'll get to know from college will never know that you had plastic surgery. So you can just tell them a lie that this was natural all along. So I think that was the idea behind a lot of these things. Also, the time after. I mean, you also have the time to do it after passing the entrance exams.
Mm-hmm. But I think this really speaks to people are unaware of how superficial Korean society is. I mean, appearance is everything there.
Oh, it's very important. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, certainly more. I mean, people think appearance is important in American or West society. It's not. I'd argue it's more important in Korean society. I mean, how you look and the clothes you wear. Unless things have changed, I don't know.
In fact, I'd argue that appearance has always been important. The external appearance of even though I think Confucius have always valued the fact that even though you don't like somebody, you're going to respect their hierarchy. So that aspect has always been there. And then also, if you think about the ideology of Confucianism, there's a heavy emphasis put on rituals, and the idea is that these rituals will give order to society and bind everybody together into a unity, because otherwise you'd be a chaotic mess. And there isn't really, I mean, as far as I can tell, I mean, I'm not a Confucius philosopher, but as far as I can tell, there isn't really good reason. There's never an inherently good reason why you should do these ancestral worship rituals. It's not like these Confucius actually believe in the supernatural. They're pretty agnostic about it. But they're saying the act of doing these rituals are important. And if you don't do these rituals, there are going to be consequences. So, I mean, in that aspect, I mean, there's always been that aspect of the society, I would say, that has looked at the surface or the kind of act of doing things as being very important, regardless of what you are on the inside.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm trying to remember when the family prepares the big, it's like a feast. There's fruits, and there are all these different things, and you look at a picture of a dead family member, and
yeah.
So
I think some people say that this is good luck because the ghosts, your ancestral ghosts, will bless you.
Right.
I think if you ask, the famous remark by Confucius himself, obviously, is that I think somebody asked him about death, and he said, I don't know everything there is to know about life, so I'm not that concerned about death. I think that's the thing. So there's this kind of agnostic attitude about it, and they don't really care about why. It's not really of a concern that why you're doing it. It's important that you do it so that the family order is preserved.
Right. And the final question, since you're Korean, do you believe that fans left on while you're sleeping will suck the air out of your lungs and kill you?
So back in the mid-90s, I tried to convince my friends that this was not true. It's that leaving a fan on while you're sleeping will not kill you.
Yeah.
I could never convince them. Because at the same time that I was saying this was back in the day so this is in the 90s, early 90s. So this is at the same time where it was actually on the news. I mean, people were saying okay, there's just been this. So it was on the news, and it said, well, there's been this death, and he was killed by this fan left on while he was sleeping. So it was on the official news. And no matter what I said, my friends were never going to be convinced by it. So,
right. So if the audience doesn't know it, to this day there's this mishin, right? Superstition that, if you're going, let's say you're going to bed and you leave the fan on, say in the summertime, the fan will suck the oxygen, the air out of your lungs, and you'll die. They actually believe this. Most, I guess, even.
I think there's other versions of it. I think I try to argue with my friends, and I think one version I heard was that the fan will blow the carbon dioxide on the floor to your nose so that you're gonna die from too much carbon dioxide. I mean, it was
interesting. Okay,
yeah.
I didn't
That's
know
another
that.
version that I heard.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, it's strange that they believe that. But then again, I mean, you kind of exist outside of that. You've spent time in the United States. You're obviously, even by Korean standards, part of the elite. I mean, it's unlikely that you would believe that sort of thing. So yeah, I guess Gio doesn't believe that you could be killed by leaving a fan on at night.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that people don't believe that anymore. But in the '90s, I thought it was hopeless. I mean, I was telling my friends, I literally left the fan on while I was sleeping, and I'm not dead, but nobody believes it.
Yeah.
So, the media has a strong power on people.
Yeah, indeed. Well, there's a lot of information. I think for the people in the audience who didn't know much about South Korea, well, now you know a lot more about it. And I think it was based on my knowledge, a very accurate description of it. I mean, nothing was sugar-coated. I mean, that's basically what South Korea is like, even to this day.
Yeah, to give the standard caveat, this is my experience and, Stardust's experience, and sometimes we do look at the data. Other times there is no data. We can only infer based off our experience. And you're always going to find people that aren't, there are exceptions to the rule, but we can only say what's honestly observed by us, I suppose.
Sajon, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I didn't, when I left South Korea, I had it was a rough time. I worked a lot. I was stressed out. I have a friend who's still there to this day. He married a Korean girl. I mean, I don't know how great the marriage is, but ironically, or strangely enough, her family has more money than his. He came from a relatively poor family in the United Kingdom, and he's been able to climb pretty high, and he's doing a lot better there than he ever did in the United Kingdom. But
yeah, so I think one aspect. This is so if you're Korean and you speak good English, this is also a sort of a status symbol. And you're going to find this in a lot of other Asian countries as well. If you're of that nationality and you speak good English or relatively good English, this is going to mean that you have had a lot of education. A lot of times learning foreign languages in Asia, it costs a lot of money.
Oh yeah.
And then still not if you are white, I think, I'm not sure how this works anymore, but I think a lot of times Koreans will are going to be looking for white people for whatever reason to give to have a white face on things is going to give whatever you're selling more credibility or perceived credibility.
Some sort of joke.
I think there's another aspect to it. Sometimes when people come to Asia, they realize their natural ability, let's say, better. I think one of the more famous examples is in Japan after the war. Guy's name was it's Edwards Deming. So this guy was no loser in the United States. So this is a very smart person. Edwards Deming was a very smart person in the United States, but he wasn't. He wasn't widely known or anything like that. He went to Japan because Douglas MacArthur. So Douglas MacArthur is the commander of Japan after the war. He was in command of the U.S. Army in the Pacific, I think.
Yeah.
And he brought him over. And Edwards Deming, he was relatively unknown. He was smart and successful, but he was relatively unknown in the United States. And then when he came to Japan, I think what happened was he was revered. And a lot of the Japanese quality that you see in the Japanese products are oftentimes traced back to this guy, Edwards Deming, because of the reforms that, and the ideas that he put out to Japanese manufacturing. So sometimes you'll see what you perceive to be Asian, like Japanese quality, for example. It has some roots in these types of things, and he was able to kind of I mean, there's a award named after him in Japan, and he's very respected there. I think he was relatively unknown in the United States until like around like 1980. I mean, until the 1980s, when I think Americans realized that they were at a competitive disadvantage relative to Japanese manufacturing.
Mm.
And then I think there's another story. Okay, so I have another story related to Western influence in what seems to be Eastern. Is actually what's called the lunar calendar. It's actually a lunisolar calendar. So when you say Chinese New Year, it's based on a lunisolar calendar, right? This calendar is actually not Chinese. It's German. So there's this German Jesuit priest who was in China during the Qing dynasty, and he created this calendar because a lot of these lunar calendars are going to be, because they're not based on the sun, it's always going to be off. So he created this lunisolar calendar for the Chinese, and that's what the Koreans use as well. And that's what that is the calendar that determines this Chinese New Year or Lunar New Year. And it's actually German if you look at the origin.
Interesting. Well, I've been at it for quite some time, and it's getting late where I am. But I think we covered a lot of information. If there are ever more specifics, Joe is an economist, regarding economic matters in South Korea or really anywhere in the world. What is your economic specialty, by the way?
So I do financial economics and labor economics.
Okay.
By the way, with economics, it's actually another interesting topic. I know you're interested in things like diversity and things like that. If you're interested, it's not just that paper written by Robert Putnam.
Right.
There are also papers written by economists that have looked at diversity and basically find the same results.
Interesting.
So it's something. I'm willing to talk about economics as well. It's something that I'm personally interested in. So anything related to finance or labor. So labor means anything from education, minimum wage, immigration, things like that.
Pay gap.
Yeah. So regarding the pay gap, so I think economists get a lot of hate, but it's the one field in social science that isn't totally dominated by SJWs.
Because you need to use mathematics and that kind of stuff. Is a bit too hard for them, right?
Yeah, there are still more Democrats than Republicans, for example. But the Democrats you're going to find.
The other thing is it's one of the few social sciences where the majority are men, right?
Oh yeah, there's actually another study in economics that is very interesting. So I think they did what they did was they wanted to find discrimination against women in academia. So they sent out identical resumes except the sexes were changed. Mm-hmm. And the results came back, and the results were women were far more likely to get any type of opportunities, like postdocs or anything like that, than a man would, given the identical qualifications. Except for economics. In economics, it's actually...
I remember that. That was particularly in the biological sciences. I remember that study. Yeah.
But the only exception was economics, because in economics, there wasn't a preference given to women just because of that resume change. Right. In the American universities, departments are given a quota, so sometimes they do have to hire women. But other than that, if they are given a choice, I think it does seem like econ is one of those fields that aren't as SJW dominated, but they still look at the same type of research, so similar types of questions like the gender pay gap, and that's why you have economic studies that can kind of offer a rebuttal to whatever Barack Obama or anyone else said about it.
Yeah, that'd be good in the future if we could talk more specifically about economic matters, particularly labor markets and what have you.
Yeah.
Everyone, thank you for tuning in on this weekend evening where I am. And I want to thank my guest for joining me and sharing his knowledge of South Korea. It sort of brought back distant memories of the place.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.